Welcome back, everyone, to part 3 as we work our way through Historia Civilis' series of videos on the life and career of Julius Caesar. We're working through their playlist as they have it, so I know there are other videos that are connected with this time period, and we will get to those, but I'm working my way through this particular playlist. If you did not see the first 2 videos that I did reactions to, the link is in the description back to the first one. After this, we will probably take a little break from this. We'll come back to it from time to time and do a couple of more videos until I think there are 27 of them altogether. We will work our way through all of them, and they are all going to be in one playlist, so you'll be able to easily find them that way. With that said, we will be moving on to some other content starting tomorrow, probably a little more Great War content because I have been heavily focused, spending probably about 3 hours a day doing research for my upcoming trip to France, which is just over 2 weeks away now. Trying to get as much information put together so that I can maximize my time there and bring you probably 6 to 7 videos worth of content for each day that I'm in France. So let's go ahead and dive into Caesar versus Ariovistus.
Shortly after Caesar's victory over the Helvetii, he received a barrage of messages from Gallic tribes, thanking him for dealing with the invaders and congratulating him on his victory. They then asked if they could come and see him in person. It was all quite mysterious, and they insisted that everybody take an oath of secrecy before the meeting. Once face to face, they told Caesar about a German king named Ariovistus. Apparently, Ariovistus had been invited across the Rhine by some Gallic tribe to intervene in a dispute, and had just started to gobble up territory for himself.
Now here's the thing about the Germanic tribes. So Gallic, sometimes also known as Celtic because of the culture, it's all very confusing because it's sometimes difficult to define who qualifies as a Gaul, who qualifies as a Celt, who qualifies as Germanic. It's all kind of gray areas, and different historians have different criteria that they use. But generally, Gaul is France. Germanic tribes are going to be then in the areas that today speak German. I mean, that's a pretty oversimplistic way of describing it. The difference is that the Gallic tribes were very well known to the Romans. They understood them. They knew a lot about them. They had subdued some of them. They had started to Romanize some of them, as I mentioned in previous videos. The Germans were a different story. They were very mysterious to the Romans. There were a lot of Romans who had a great deal of fear of their Germanic tribes. 60, 70 years earlier, there had been some run-ins with the Germanic tribes that had not gone particularly well for the Roman Republic. And so that's still in their memory. So this is an interesting thing. But what's happening now is you got these Gallic tribes saying, oh, thank you for taking care of those hundreds of thousands of Helvetii that were trying to invade our territory. Now, while we've got you here and we know you can fight, could you go deal with this other guy, Ariovistus, who's been threatening us?
He then began to bring large numbers of Germans across the Rhine in an effort to colonize his new territory. He now had 120,000 Germans living in Gaul, with plans.
Isn't it interesting, by the way, that, and I don't know if this is just the way this map is drawn, if this is exactly the area we're talking about, but this area today we know as Alsace and Lorraine, at least in English-speaking world. I think Lorraine is like Lothringen or something in German. But anyway, that area has gone back and forth between France and Germany for centuries. It transferred hands after the Franco-Prussian War. It went back after World War I. And so this is an area that has gone between the French and the Germans, even going back to when it was the Gauls and the Germanic tribes.
Plans to bring more. As a cherry on top, Ariovistus had also attacked Rome's closest ally in Gaul, and had forced them to disavow their treaty with the Romans, and to provide an annual tribute to Ariovistus instead. Nobody in Gaul was happy about this. The Gauls then got to the point of this secret meeting. They formally asked Caesar to intervene on their behalf. Caesar agreed to meet with Ariovistus to see if he could get him to moderate his behavior.
And why would they want it to be a secret meeting? Well, you don't want Ariovistus to know that you were one of the people that went to speak to somebody about dealing with him. You don't want to put a target on your back. So it's, everybody's trying to use one or the other. Some of them are using Ariovistus on their side. Ariovistus is not doing anything the Romans wouldn't do. He's conquering territory. He's settling it with his citizens. He's demanding tribute for his army and for his empire, so to speak. It's not really an empire, but you know what I mean.
I don't want to make it sound like Caesar was doing this for altruistic reasons.
A law had been passed in 61 BCE instructing all governors of Transalpine Gaul to protect Rome's Gallic allies whenever they were able.
In other words, Caesar had a mandate from Rome to act on this if he wanted to.
But even more to the point, Ariovistus was encroaching on Rome's sphere of influence.
And doing nothing in response would do some real damage to Rome's credibility in the region.
Caesar sent a message to Ariovistus,
asking for a meeting on neutral ground.
Ariovistus wrote back, saying, "No, if you want to meet, come to me."
Obviously, negotiations were off to a great start. Caesar sent a second message, reminding Ariovistus that Caesar had been the one to legitimize his rise to power during his year as consul. This was a not-so-veiled threat. He was saying, "I made you. I could easily unmake you."
There's a quote that goes all the way back to the 1980s on the Cosby Show. I know that doesn't get played on TV anymore for obvious reasons, but Bill Cosby's character says to his son, "I brought you into this world, and I can take you out." And for generations, parents have been using that on their kids, and that's kind of what Caesar's saying here. I made you, I can unmake you if I need to. Don't cross me.
Caesar then listed his demands.
First, he instructed Ariovistus to immediately stop bringing Germans across the Rhine.
Second, he instructed him to return all of his Gallic hostages. Third, he told him to immediately cease all military activity.
Ariovistus sent a simple reply.
He said that the Romans were free to run their conquests as they saw fit, and so was he. Cheeky. Around the same time, Caesar also received two pieces of intelligence. First, he got word that Ariovistus had mobilized an army and was marching on his neighbors again. Second, he started to get reports of hundreds of thousands of Germans on the other side of the Rhine, preparing for a crossing. This was getting serious.
Caesar gathered his men and set off towards Ariovistus.
On the march, he got word that the German army was moving towards a town called Vesontio. This was bad. This town was well fortified, and Caesar wasn't interested in continuing negotiations with a guy behind strong walls, much less conducting a siege if it came to that. He left his supply wagons behind, and pushed his men forward at a breakneck pace, marching all day and all night, and arriving in Vesontio just before the Germans could reach it. He stayed there for several days, allowing his men to rest while his supply wagons caught up. When he was ready, Caesar marched out and closed in with Ariovistus' army. He sent messengers to set up a face-to-face meeting.
Ariovistus had some specific ground rules for the meeting.
He asked that exactly 10 men on horseback accompany each general. Caesar had cavalry, but they all happened to be Gauls, so fearing some sort of trap or betrayal, he had some of his most loyal infantry mounted on Gallic horses. This led to some of his men joking that he was treating them so well that he made them into equitae. If you don't get the joke, it's a pun. Equitae means both horsemen and a wealthy Roman. So the two generals and their retinues met on an open field. Caesar simply reiterated what he had told Ariovistus in his letter. He demanded that no more Germans cross the Rhine, that the Gallic hostages be returned, and the cessation of all military activities. Ariovistus said that this was now his province, just as Transalpine Gaul was Caesar's province. He said that he and the Romans had won their respective provinces through conquest, fair and square.
Ariovistus then leveled a threat,
saying that many politicians back in Rome would probably be overjoyed if he killed Caesar right now.
So Ariovistus is a really interesting character, and we don't really know a lot about him. We know some, and most of it comes from Caesar and other Romans. But you can tell this guy knows his opponent. And there's actually a lot of parallels here between Caesar, and he's trying to make that point that, hey, we're alike. We're both leading big armies. We both conquered territory. We both have subdued peoples and had them pay us tribute. And hey, I understand that you are not necessarily the most popular person back in Rome. And basically what he's saying is that that Caesar doesn't necessarily have the backing of Rome. Like, it's not like Ariovistus could kill Caesar and, wipe out his legions and Rome's going to come back with 10 times the number to avenge him. What he's telling Caesar is, hey, you're on your own here, buddy. And there's a lot of people on your side that probably wouldn't feel too bad if I take you down.
Damn. This comment caused a fight to break out between the horsemen. Caesar would say that the Germans started it, but he would say that, wouldn't he? Caesar immediately broke off negotiations and had his men return to camp.
A few days later, Ariovistus sent another message,
saying that he was interested in another meeting. Caesar was understandably suspicious considering how the last one ended.
He sent his favorite Gallic interpreter to go and see what Ariovistus wanted.
It's a good thing he did, because in fact it was a trap.
Ariovistus took Caesar's interpreter prisoner
and would spend the next several days arguing with his religious advisors over whether or not they should burn him alive as a religious sacrifice.
Ariovistus mobilized his army,
and in a surprise move marched all the way around Caesar's position and encamped on a hill behind him.
This put him...
Again, pulling kind of a Caesar move, right? This is the kind of thing Caesar would do. Go around and try to get the advantage of the terrain. He had done this at a previous battle where he sent a couple of his legions around.
In a good position to intercept Caesar's grain shipments. Not great for Caesar. Ariovistus was leading an army of around 30,000,
and Caesar had somewhere around 25,000.
Caesar and Ariovistus both deployed for battle
5 days in a row. There was the occasional cavalry skirmish, but no outright attack. Caesar was now under pressure to attack before he ran out of food.
See, that's the thing, and Ariovistus understood that. He's not only got the high ground, but he's forcing Caesar into a situation where he has to attack before he runs out of food. So Caesar doesn't have the luxury of just sitting there throwing up some fortifications like he might otherwise have done and waiting for the enemy to attack him.
And with Ariovistus holding the high ground, this was a recipe for disaster.
So Caesar came up with a plan. He marched his army out of his camp in 3 columns, leaving a small garrison behind. He then marched just beyond the German hill.
Ariovistus saw what he was doing
and sent out his cavalry and half of his infantry in response. Why only half? We'll get to that in a minute. Caesar had expected a German response, which is why he had his men in 3 columns rather than 1. He instructed 2 columns to turn and hold the Germans off, while the third one began to construct a fortified encampment.
There was some skirmishing back and forth, but Ariovistus never really pushed in a coordinated attack.
And remember, we talked previously about how one of the brilliant things about Caesar and his men was the brilliance of their engineering ability. He had some just incredible engineers, and they could throw up fortifications, throw up a camp, throw up a bridge like nobody's business. And so it will not take them long to do this.
Even though the Romans were out in the open and undeniably vulnerable.
When the third line completed its construction, the Romans pulled back and the Germans didn't pursue. Caesar was now in a position where he could intercept his food shipments unmolested, which meant that he could take his time figuring out how to deal with Ariovistus. The next day was pretty uneventful, but late in the day, the Germans sent a raiding party to attack the first Roman camp. But Caesar had left a garrison and they were easily repulsed. During this engagement, some German prisoners were captured.
Under questioning, they revealed that Ariovistus had been told by his religious advisors
that victory was impossible until the next full moon.
That's why he's waiting.
That explains why he was being so cautious. Caesar decided to take full advantage of this. The next day, he marched his army straight up the hill.
And Ariovistus did not challenge him.
Now both armies were on the hill. Caesar then deployed for battle, so close to the German camp that they had no choice but to fight.
So even 2,000 years ago, you see the importance of good intelligence. Knowing something that affects your decision making. He knows Ariovistus does not want to fight. So now he can act accordingly, and this changes everything for him.
If you remember back to when Caesar fought the Helvetii, he had kept his 2 inexperienced legions in reserve at all times. Here, for the first time, he put them up front, which is a sign of their growing competence.
As Ariovistus's army prepared for battle,
Caesar observed that the Germans on the Roman right looked a little weak. That's where he positioned himself, and that's where he intended to win the battle. All of a sudden, the Germans attacked with amazing speed. It all happened so fast that the Romans didn't even have time to throw their javelins. Yep. They just had to drop them where they stood. Caesar ordered his first 2 lines forward and kept his third in reserve.
Ariovistus fought with some pretty unusual tactics, which are worth getting into here.
His infantry and cavalry coordinated very closely and were organized in mixed groups of 100. The infantry acted as a solid wall, similar to a phalanx, while the cavalry would hide behind them and launch hit-and-run attacks, coming back to regroup when needed. Each group acted independently, which meant that there were hundreds of hits and runs going on at the same time.
And so remember, we talked about this a little while ago. The Germans are a bit more of a mystery to the Romans. They have fought them before. It's been a while, but they have fought them in the past. But they don't know them like they know the Celts. And these Germans under Ariovistus are doing things Caesar hasn't seen before. And so even though he's got that advantage of intelligence, now that they've committed to a fight, he acts in the way that he would normally act, but the enemy doesn't act in a way that they expect.
It was extremely frustrating to deal with. As the battle dragged on, the Roman frustration started to show. Some dealt with the German walls of infantry by throwing themselves into them and ripping away the enemy's shields with their bare hands.
So here's the problem. When you get frustrated, sometimes you don't stick to the plan. You start to act out, you start to get more aggressive than you probably should. You start to take things into your own hands like this. There's a perfect example of something like this spelling disaster. The Battle of Hastings, 1066. William the Conqueror is losing that battle. King Harold is up on the hill. He's winning. All he's got to do, all his men have to do is hold their position and they're going to win. And some of them decide to take matters into their own hands and they advance when they should have stayed put, and it throws the battle.
I ain't never seen that in a movie. After some effort, Caesar was able to break through on the Roman right, just as he had planned. But with all of his attention devoted here, he was unaware that at the same moment, the Roman left was beginning to crumble. The commander...
He's unaware because, remember, because the Germans are thin on this side, Caesar has positioned himself over here. And so and remember, here's the hill in the middle, so he probably can't even see his left flank. So he's getting reports, but he doesn't necessarily know what's happening.
Of the Roman cavalry, Publius Licinius Crassus, son of Caesar's political ally, saw what was happening and launched into action. On his own accord, he went to the Roman third line, who were totally oblivious, and ordered them to come and reinforce the Roman left. The third line got there just in time. And
this is why you have a third line. This is why you hold back those reinforcements, but he's doing it without Caesar's permission, so you better hope it works.
The left held. This was an early example of the growing initiative of Caesar's subordinates, which would turn out to be a feature of the Gallic Wars. Soon afterwards, the German collapse on the right reverberated throughout the entire army.
I want to stop for a second there and talk about this because it's important to note the ability of Caesar's subordinates, because anytime you have a situation like this in the days before radio, the days before long-distance instant communication, and when you are a single army that is trying to conquer multiple foes that are all over the place, that you have to kind of bounce from one to the other, and that's what Caesar has to do. He fights one, then has to go and fight another. Napoleon had to do the same thing. Napoleon couldn't be everywhere. And so sometimes he would have to go from one place to another. He'd go from Austria to Spain, and then up to Germany and all these different places. And so if you don't have solid subordinates who are able to fight and carry out your wishes, you can't be everywhere at once and you can't have success.
The Germans fell apart and fled. They continued their retreat all the way back across the Rhine, pursued by a horde of angry Gauls. Those hundreds of thousands of Germans waiting to cross the Rhine heard news of this defeat and went home. As
We're
luck
out.
would have it, after the battle, Caesar's favorite Gallic interpreter was found alive, but traumatized by the constant conversations about being burned alive. Caesar would later say that discovering that he was alive gave him as much pleasure as the victory itself. With these back-to-back victories over first the Helvetii and then Ariovistus, Caesar would later say that he won 2 wars in a single summer. Rome was now well established as an indispensable power broker in the region. Caesar left his army in Gaul under the command of Labienus for the winter, and returned to his provinces to tend to his duties as governor. He'd be back next spring.
And spring's when you do the fighting. You can't really march in winter, with an army and supplies and all that sort of thing. Let's talk briefly a little bit more about what happened to Ariovistus, because honestly, we don't know a lot. But Ariovistus is a Swabian chief who led a large force of Germans across the Rhine at the beginning of the Gallic Wars. After that battle, we're told that the German retreat continued for 50 miles until the survivors reached safely across the Rhine. Ariovistus did survive, but both of his wives and one of his daughters were killed in the retreat, and his surviving daughter was captured. After that, we don't know what happened to Ariovistus. So if you know of some other sources that maybe I should be aware of that tell us a little more about what happened to Ariovistus, let us know. Use the comment section below. Let's talk more about this particular battle, this particular section of the Gallic Wars, and Ariovistus in particular, the Germanic tribes, any of that stuff. Use the comment section below. We'll come back probably in a few weeks or so and visit some further videos in this series. Thanks for watching.